Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jessica. We've heard very clearly about the residential school project, and there've been a lot of words used. We've talked about assimilation, apprehension, disappearances, and I want to add another phrase to this understanding of the residential school project. Because the residential school project was the largest forced migration of children in humanity's history. And what that means is that if we look, whether we look in the 1830s at the Trail of Tears, where over 100,000 indigenous sisters and brothers were forced to march through northeastern United States, which killed almost 90% of the people. Whether we look at 1 million Zimbabweans that have been pushed out by war and military occupation and the mining of their lands just these last 5 years and into South Africa. Whether we look at millions of our African sisters and brothers who've been enslaved and brought into and onto Turtle Island. The neoliberal project, the ongoing colonization of this land, is about stealing the people from their land. And no matter how much the colonizers have taught us, and we've come to accept that it is about stealing land, many of us think about ourselves as belonging to the land rather than otherwise. And so today, when we see at least 10 million people being pushed off their homes every year because of so-called development projects, when we see that 90% of the world's civil wars are actually fought with weapons made in the countries that don't fight those wars, the so-called greater economies, the G8s and the G20s that are coming here soon. When we see a food crisis, which less than $20 billion have been given to, while the banks have been given $7 trillion, and that each of these has forced people off of their land, has pushed people out of their homes and into other places, we see that the history of forced migration, be it of children in this horrendous fashion, continues. And when it does continue, it continues in two ways, and I think it was very clearly stated in the first few slides, that it is about both isolation and assimilation. That simultaneously the project is to push and exclude as it is to include. So what does that mean? What it means is that when you're pushed out from your lands and from your homes, so be it for so-called newcomers into this country, and you're excluded from your homeland, you're somehow included into this great imaginary thing called the Canadian, right? And what this does, this process of inclusion does, is that it allows us to celebrate the greatness of Canada. The greatness of Canada, which is about multiculturalism. It's about this charitable, benevolent nation that we can all be proud members of, right? And the way that is most clearly understood is within the idea of citizenship. And the premise of being Canadian and of having citizenship and of being, forced into residential school, for example, and therefore become Canadian, is a promise. And what is that promise? The promise is that if you are Canadian, if you can somehow be civilized, then you will have access to good food, good jobs, education, shelter, justice, dignity. And for people of color, for indigenous people, for women, for queer folk, for the disabled, and now for a lot of Muslims, we know that that promise is a lie, right? And that promise is accompanied with an ongoing criminalization. So as we are pushed out of our homes, that is excluded, and as we are included back into this thing called the Canadian, we're again pushed out of this promise. And so we are always trying to be and come back into it. We forget the places we have been removed from. And so when in this search for exclusion and being migrants on this land and having decided to stand in solidarity with the indigenous peoples in all their nations and in all their specificities, it has become increasingly important for at least the groups and communities that I work with, to actually start asking ourselves, what would real decolonization look like? How are we going to weaken this simultaneous exclusion and inclusion process? And so, in the very few minutes, I want to give you a brief introduction of a project that we call the Sanctuary City Project. And the Sanctuary City project is based on the premise of citizenship that I first introduced, which is that citizenship is merely a promise, and a promise which is both a lie and a reality. And so for 200,000 people in this country that are immigrants without documents, the undocumented, and the non-status people, there is this ongoing search for status, right? And i.e. the ongoing search to somehow be fully Canadian. But really the search is not to become part of this colonial project. None of us want to continue to be ongoing settlers. What people want is food and education and shelter and justice and dignity. And so how do we create that? And so our work, in large part, is to make Canada, Canadians, and status irrelevant and unnecessary. I'm going to give you a very quick, brief history. In 2006, 2 children, Kimberly and Lizano Sosa, were at school here in Toronto. They were children without documents. Immigration enforcement barged into their classrooms, grabbed them, threw them into a white van where they found their sister, their mother, and their grandmother, and they were driven to an immigration enforcement center. The children in those schools called our organizations, and we organized a rally of over 400 people, and we marched onto the detention center. And in response to this large public outcry, they were released. And when they were released, 16-year-old Kimberly stepped out, and she had no idea what was happening, and she saw all of these people outside, cameras shoved into her face, somebody put a mic to her, and she said, "This is not fair. This should not happen to me, this should not happen to any other people. Everyone has the right to education." And this simple statement became a rallying cry for our work. And when it became a rallying cry for our work, we stepped up and went into the Toronto District School Board and demanded that they not allow immigration enforcement into their spaces. But this wasn't just about talking to the Toronto District School Board. We started talking to the teachers. Then we started talking to the staff. Then we started talking to the students. And then we started talking about to the parents. And now we were no longer talking about the so-called plight of non-status people. We were talking about how migration is part of Canada's colonial history, ongoing, present. And initially the schools were unwilling to let us, unwilling to break the law, the so-called Canadian law, right, that everyone must uphold. And after going over and over again, after banging at the doors, finally this vote was called in the Toronto District School Board. And Toronto became the first city in Canada, the only city in Canada, where non-status children can go to school. Now I'm going to tell you how this connects. Because after that, in 2008, we went into anti-violence against women shelters. And very, very soon, we're going to see that immigration enforcement is going to be pushed out of those spaces. We have a campaign that is in food banks, and we are doing the same thing. We have a campaign in health centers, and we are doing the same thing. But what we're doing is that we're going into spaces, and we're talking to the people that work there, the people that access those services, and the people that are excluded there. And we're saying, you have the power to change this place. And what that means is it doesn't matter what federal immigration law is, you can change it. Because we are the operators, we are complicit in these little minute policies that actually allow colonization to continue. And when people realize and people begin to awaken to the idea that we can shove immigration out of our spaces, that we can make a space safe for non-status people, then the question becomes, who else can we make it safe for? We can make it safe for Indigenous folks. We can make it safe for women. We can make it safe for queer communities. We can make it safe for disabled communities. And so site by site, space by space, we are taking Toronto. We are liberating it. We're making it free for ourselves. We're saying we may not be able to change the law, but we will change the way it's being implemented. We will make status unnecessary. We will make federal law unnecessary, unable to be applied here. Right? And we're doing this through a process of education. Because when we go into women's shelters, and shelter by shelter, there are 12 anti-violence against women shelters in the city, and in each of them we're doing presentations and workshops and educationals, and talking about the colonial history here, as well as the histories that force people out of their homes. We're creating a conscious awakened, we're creating a conscious awakened community that can start talking about what it would mean to make the idea of Canada so weak that we as people can take over, right? And so that is why I want to talk about building bridges, building steps in the future as people, as a future, and for that, it might mean honoring treaties, it might mean the liberation of our cities, but it has to mean by beginning to ask ourselves new ways. Right? This is no longer a time for advocacy. This is no longer a time for trying to change the law. We have to start asking ourselves, where can we, right now, make change? And for that, I'm delighted to be sitting next to these two wonderful women, and I'm going to finish with that, and hopefully, any more.